Well, welcome. Today is a very special moment because today we have our very first live interview for really the last several months. For those of you who have been journeying with us, you know that stories have always been really important here at Hoboken Grace, and giving people the opportunity to hear from people just like them as we're encountering all that God has for us in this journey. And for the past couple months, everything has been over Zoom, and we've been distant. And today we're continuing to be distant, but we are able to be together. That's right. But we are able to actually be together in the space, which is really exciting. And I'm really excited to have Beatrice join us. For those of you who don't know, a couple weeks ago, you reached out to me about a week or so following the George Floyd murder, and we had the opportunity to just connect and talk a little bit about experience and what was happening, and what does that mean for our community, what does that mean for our church family. And as we were in the midst of that conversation, we began to talk about this not just being something that we talk through, but actually bringing that to our church family. And I'm really excited to be able to do that. And to get started, if you would, just give us a little bit of the story in terms of what the past couple weeks, the past, I guess, month now, has been like for you.
Yeah, so I reached out because I wanted to share my story with you, but also wanted to give some insight, because I think when you look at something like a George Floyd situation and a nation kind of in uproar, there's lots of touch points and reasons for that. And for me, I'm, obviously African American, but I grew up in Chicago, and I had just left Chicago to kind of memorial. My brother had passed, so I just left Chicago in March and came into New York right as everything was shut down. So there was this kind of big transition and change for me coming in just for COVID-19. And then a few weeks, I guess a couple of months after that, George Floyd's murder created an entire additional layer to that scenario, specifically coming from Chicago. And I had called you to share my story with you, because I think the more that we know that George Floyd's situation is something that happens to people that we know, and the historic impact of that, I think it's different, so it's not episodic for us. So essentially, in sharing my story, I shared with Chris that I grew up in Chicago. The George Floyd murder happened right as I was celebrating my 50th birthday in quarantine. So though I may look younger, I was born in 1970. I grew up in kind of desegregated Chicago. I grew up in the projects. I grew up in what is considered the good times projects. And so I grew up just a couple of miles away from where that was filmed. So I grew up in a, very kind of predominant Black community, impoverished Black community. But from a young age, I actually was bused to a neighboring school for academic growth. So I was, a very academic kid, a very smart kid. But in being bused to the neighborhood that I was bused to, which was called Bridgeport, it was one of the most prejudiced and racist communities in Chicago at that time. I was on a yellow school bus. There was a lot of teasing. When our school bus would pull up to the school, we would have parents and students outside of that school throwing bottles at our bus, throwing bricks at our bus, telling us, "Negro, go home." They didn't use the word Negro. We'd have to kind of hover under the seats and take cover. But within that, the segregation, or kind of the desegregation effort, didn't stop. They didn't take us out of that school. My mom didn't take me out of that school. And at the time, I was too young to even question why she would have me to experience that. But in growing up, I realized a lot of things from that. For one, my mom was a lamp factory worker, and in her work environment, she worked with all nationalities, so Latino, Black, white, and in her workplace, she had a unique situation in that though she was from Louisiana and had migrated to the North, like a lot of Black people did, to get away from a lot of the kind of prejudice and racism that was happening, she learned that in her relationships one-on-one, she had a different experience. And so she didn't pull me out of that school, though I was having a very kind of scary and threatening experience, because she knew that that was the world that I was going to have to live in. And you can't hide from this world that you live in. But even within the school, as I got to know the students and became acclimated to it, my best friends, I have few friends, books were mostly my friends, but I had a white best friend, I had a Black best friend, and I had a Mexican best friend. Those were my three best friends. And so even though I was going to this school where in a large number, they were rejecting my being there, one-on-one, as I looked at relationships, I could see that individuals are very different from a collective much of the time, though that collective, in this instance being their parents, and possibly the mindset of some administrators, although administrators wouldn't openly participate in that, it's different. That experience taught me a lot about how to navigate and evaluate the world. And as threatening as it was, it also taught me the resilience that I would need growing up as an African American in Chicago. Kind of fast forwarding to the world that we live in now, I think there are a lot of people from across America and even beyond who have had experiences like that growing up. Some obvious rejection and violence like what I experienced, some very subtle. Sometimes it is that you're the only Black person in a room. Sometimes it's that when they see your name on a resume, they know that you're Black. The difficulty with addressing racism in America for people who typically don't encounter Black people or are not in proximity to Black people is that they don't realize that the opportunity for racism happens at a distance. And so because you're Black, at a distance, someone can make decisions, be it that it's someone who is in authority, like you spoke of, like, a policeman or, someone who's, in a high power level, or someone who is just living down the street from you. At a distance, they can see that. And at a distance, they can start to make decisions or behaviors and rationalize the reasons why that happens. In my reaching out to you, I wanted to share my story because my story is different from George Floyd's. I wasn't murdered, right? But we know that there are these power struggles that happen. And I think when I looked at the protest, I initially shut down and I just wanted to not dive into the chaos that was happening because it's so very familiar to me. So in some ways, we can experience things and we can have healing from some of the wounds that we have, and we can have a festering of it, so to speak. So from a young age, I was able to heal the wounds that happened with me through racism, growing up in Chicago, and even, I think, on a frequent basis, seeing the effects of racism in our daily lives. When something like a inciting incident happens, when we're talking Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, or George Floyd, that can reignite some of the wounds that people have had, and it can reignite a charge, anger, a disappointment, lots of things that can happen kind of from that inciting incident. And I think that's why we started to see so many protests. I think the advantage in shutting down temporarily is that I get to deal with me and process. But then after dealing with me and processing, I then have to move to a point of dealing and coping and action. And so I reached out to you because I said, okay, here was my experience, and here's how I dealt with the wounds and healed and processed. And now how do I move forward? I feel a responsibility because though I do this on a daily basis, and I think in some ways, living in Africa as an African American, just living as a protest. And there's a great photographer that's kind of done a series about that, Ruddy Roy, where living is a protest. Sometimes it's that you just have to live to get to the next thing, but also you have to then get involved to move forward to the next thing. And it's more than just being a part of a moment in time. It's about being a part of a future process and a future way. And I wanted to talk with you to see what that could look like, while also being very transparent and authentic in what my experiences have been, what my mindset has been, and recognizing that my experiences and mindset are unique to me, and that it's not the only facet of the diamond. There's multiple perspectives and multiple things, but we can create a whole that really makes something different.
Yeah, I as we were talking through your story on the phone, I think there are, even as people are watching, I know there are going to be people who are watching and thinking, man, I thought that experience was so long ago, and that it's just it's a massive mistake,
right,
that people make with that, and I had the opportunity to share with you a little bit of my story, because when I was a sophomore in high school, I wanted to play college basketball, so I transferred to the best school in the state to play basketball there, and it was predominantly black school. I was one of 2 white kids on the basketball team, and I stepped into a world that I'd never seen before, I'd never experienced before, both culturally, but then also the divide that was present at that school. It was Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I remember, because I started practicing with the basketball team long before school started, mm-hmm. because with this school, basketball was a year-round program. And so I'd built a lot of relationships and friendships. And I remember walking into the lunchroom and going to sit down next to one of my friends who was black and being told, no, that doesn't happen in the lunchroom.
Right.
Like there were white tables and there were black tables. And though we were friends, I mean, really good friends on the team, there was this. And I can distinctly remember standing there and just being like, what
just happened?
Being so confused and so and really navigating that, where and this is not distant past. This is where there were white dances and then there were black dances and mm-hmm. Just I think that one of the things that we talked about is just the importance of people being able to share those stories so that people understand that, no, this isn't something in a history book somewhere.
Yeah, there are so many layers to that. Like, I love that you say that. So you had the opposite experience that I had, in that I was a black girl who went to a predominantly white school. You were a white man who went to a predominantly black school. And there are these really obvious instances of discomfort and social norms and boundaries that you encounter, and you can only encounter when you have that proximity to the culture and situation. And then there are other subtle ways where that kind of rears its head. And like you said, it wasn't long ago, but I can think even in the past several months, where when I'm speaking to someone, and I've been hearing this since I was a kid, when I'm speaking to someone and, they're talking or we're getting to know each other, and then say they go to my LinkedIn profile and then they see that I'm black, and then they say, oh, I didn't realize that you were African American. Now, it takes a really bold person to say something like that, because it's so inappropriate. And sometimes the things that people think and the things that people say, it's kind of breathtaking, because whereas many people may think that, when people say it, I actually appreciate that they say it, even though it's bold and completely insane. Because what people are saying when they say something like that is, you speak so different from what I consider urban language or what I consider street language or media language or what I've seen on the television. You use proper English. And so I didn't expect that you would be Black. And that's something I've been hearing since I was a kid, but that's a form of racism that also comes forth. Because if you think that language, and I love language, so, I speak Portuguese, I've studied Italian and French, I love language. One of the things that I appreciate about language is created by a region or by a culture for communication. That's all it is. It's just communication. In church, we have our own language as well. So it's just something to communicate. But when someone says that my way of communicating is attributed to a certain race, then that is also a problem, and then you have to address that. I've also, had good-meaning people say to me something like, oh, well, especially primarily people who didn't grow up in the U.S., who come here from the U.S., from Europe or other places, white people. They say, oh, I don't really understand this African-American experience. Can you explain it to me? I don't understand why there are all these conflicts about racism and about Black people and all these references to slavery. And they'll say, because it was so long ago. So then we go from civil rights being, within our lifetimes but slavery was so long ago. And as we just celebrated Juneteenth, we know it wasn't that long ago. And the effects of that are still so dominant that we're needing to deal with that. And so when we look at our everyday and we look at the racism of our everyday, we need to look at it's more than, do I know a Black person? Like, yes, you may know a Black person, but what do you think about that Black person? What conversations do you have with that Black person? When was the last time you were in a room and had a conversation with that Black person? I can remember even you and I don't know, 10 years, 12 years ago. It's been a long time since I've been here at Hoboken Grace. But I remember reaching out to you and saying, because I work in marketing and media, and saying, hey, Chris, I have so many ideas that we can use for social media. I think there's such a great message that we can get across. And this is what I do for a living. I do digital marketing for a living. I'd love to get together and talk with you. And right away you were like, that's great. Let's get together. Let's meet at a Starbucks. Right away you create proximity. And that's something that people aren't doing. Now, granted, you have a lot of experience with Black people, but your experience with Black people and the encounters that you'll have as a Black person is really different. And I think that's where the conversation comes into play, because you can know a lot of Black people, but you'll never have the experience of being a Black person because you don't have that skin. And so the more that you can dive into relationship and communication with people who are not like you, so this isn't just a white people, you need to get to know Black people thing. That's not what I'm saying. Have some conversations with some Black people and have them over for lunch. I'm not saying that. I'm saying Black, white, Latino, wherever you're from, get to know people who are not like you, and not superficially. Get to have conversations with them and get in relationship with them, because only then will you start to experience the conversations that take you beyond the surface of what that person's life is like.
And I think what you're speaking to there, it needs to be vulnerable conversation.
Exactly.
Because there's factual conversation, mm-hmm. and then there's vulnerable conversation.
Right.
So I talk about it in terms of marriage. So if you're really going to have intimate conversation, you can't just share the facts of your day. You have to share how did that impact your heart. Mm-hmm. How did I feel in that moment? What were the fears that came up in that moment? And being able to get to that point, I have a friend, Rich, who I love to have these conversations with, and someone that I turn to quite frequently. And I'll often just sit and just ask questions of him, like mm-hmm. just to dig
That's
in.
That's the best, yes. Because when you have a real relationship with someone, you can ask questions that you would never ask someone else. Like I have a friend who, he's of a different faith. He's Muslim, and I can ask him really detailed stuff about his choices and his lifestyle based on that I can't ask someone else because I don't have a relationship that is built in trust and honesty, right? With, and so that's what real relationship and kind of friendship brings. And I think kind of, and diving into that, you only get to a place of vulnerability when you yourself are willing to be vulnerable in that relationship.
Yep.
Protests are great because without protests, we would not have achieved as much as we did with civil rights, though we are still having to fight for a lot of those civil rights. But what I want us to do as a society today, because we're seeing the exact same scene play out today that we saw in the 60s, is when you put that sign down, you don't then just go on social media and talk about it. You then do something. You then act on it. You then are putting something on the table, and you're creating risk, whatever that risk may be. It's not that everyone needs to quit their job, become an activist, and go out, but you're creating risk. That risk can be that you're open up and being vulnerable. That risk can be that you are being someone who creates more challenge in your conversations, that you stop making excuses, that you stop allowing others to make excuses, whatever that is. It's taking that activism beyond the moment and beyond the signs and the marching and the, how you put it, kind of the Instagram effect, right? Of, I was there. It's more than I was there. I wasn't at any of the protests, selectively for many reasons. But you don't have to be at a protest to create change and activism in response and in support of the protest. Yeah. And that's what I think every person needs to do, is kind of look and see what their role is. And then from that role, make sure that it's really threaded in truth for who you are. Because if it's really threaded in truth and change that you want to see, then you can do something like call up your pastor and say, hey, I want to talk to you. I want to share my story with you while all of this is going on. I want you to know more about me. And then I want you to take that information and connect me with others who may be interested in moving forth in this way, so that as a group, we can create something different and something new. And that's the purpose of opening yourself up, right? It's not just to, kind of introduce a false sense of validation, yeah. Right? You have to go beyond it and go behind the scenes. And the things you do behind the scenes are the things that really are going to have a greater impact time after time and create routine and kind of become habitual, right?
Yeah, and one of my great fears is that the social media phenomenon, that it actually hurts progress because there isn't movement, right? There's just, it's interesting because I went to the protest here in Hoboken, and I had multiple people tell me, like, you should post that you were there.
Right.
I'm like, no, I'm not posting. Like, it's not why I'm going.
Because that's what matters, right?
And it's about, what are we going to do? What's going to come out of this? And it does. It takes a level of vulnerability, and that's why I think that healing is so important, that we talked about earlier, right? Because it's so hard to be vulnerable in that way if there's not healing.
Yeah.
And when you've been wounded, if that wound's still open, everything that touches it.
Right. Yeah. We were talking about that. It's like I was talking about, because the first time, when I called you to share my story and I talked about everything that happened with me going to my school, I took pauses and I was like, let me take a drink. And I had to drink water because it's emotional. I'm not emotional right now because I'm telling it to you a second time. But when I'm telling someone new, or I'm reflecting, or I go into great detail about that, it's still powerful. It still can bring tears because it's something that I experienced, and I actively worked to heal that, and actively worked to forgive. There's so many reasons why, but forgiveness is both for myself and for my belief in God, because not having that forgiveness will destroy you. It just, and I have personal kind of reasons for thinking lots of those things that happened from childhood. Because, I grew up around a lot of chaos, right? And that chaos did not become me, but I couldn't ignore the chaos that I grew up around. And so when I look at the wounds that I've experienced, I knew that I needed to take an active role in my healing. And then also from a wound and a gash, there's a scar. I have this scar on my arm from way back in the day when I was in an elevator and you could smoke on elevators. And a woman was smoking and she just tapped her cigarette and the ashes fell. I was a little girl, might have been, 7 or 8 years old. Would never have known that scar, that wound would leave a permanent scar, but that's what wounds do. They leave a scar. So it's about healing the wound, and the more you can talk about it and deal with it and have community and friends and family to help you and kind of medicate you to deal with that wound, the better. But then also it leaves a scar. So when you see the scar, don't ignore the scar. Don't ignore people's scars. Ask them what happened here, what was the effect of that? How does that affect you today? Because depending on where that scar is, so Chris knows this, but a lot of people, you don't know me, so you wouldn't know it. But 4 years ago, I had a brain hemorrhage. My brain was bleeding. So I am a miracle. We all are, but I feel like an extra miracle. But my brain was bleeding. I had a brain hemorrhage. They went in to do surgery. There was all these kind of amazing things that happened. But since that point, what I've kind of started to dive into is learning how the brain works. And the brain will remap its neurons in order to act and service you in the way that it was designed to do. And so when I look at the way that we navigate this world and our wounds and our hurts and hangups, I start to look at, okay, we need healing and we need to give attention to the fresh wound, and then we need to heal that wound. And then there's the scar. And when you first have an injury, you just want to kind of hide in a corner because you don't want anyone to touch you. It's really painful. It's really difficult. But then as it starts to heal, you can start to function, closer to normal again. But then there's the scar. And then you have the scar as a reminder of kind of what you've been through and of the potential of pain out there and the potential of discomfort or injustice or whatever it is. So we have to work with one another to heal, not just what happens to someone when they're a kid. This happened to me as a kid, but in my everyday as an adult, as a 50-year-old woman, what do I encounter that has the potential to wound me? And then who is my triage, right? Who do I run to be able to address that wound? And I think that's what I'm really mindful of, the connectors that I have in my life, the people that I have in my life, the family that, are your selected family, which we have a lot of kind of here in tri-state areas. Like all my family's in Chicago, with one of my sisters in Kansas City. So I'm here in, Jersey all by myself. Hoboken Grace is my family. My friends here are my family. And so those are my triage if something happens to me. I can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I'm going through this. And if Chris isn't available, I can call Rachel. If Rachel's not available, I can call Aaron. There's this group of people that I can connect to. I also have, friends who are in my neighborhood, friends who, I grew up with who have moved here, but I have this triage that can help me to deal with the wounds that I have. But we need to also be triage for other people. And I think that's the opportunity that presents itself with everything that's happening right now, because we've got these two layers of disparity. One which is, arguably not man-made, which is COVID-19, right? And then the layer of that.
I get the arguably.
Yes. It's like, there's so much controversy over that. I'm like, I can't.
Yeah.
I can't with you people.
Well,
right. So, but we've got these two layers. And I think why there's so much uproar right now is both of those things are very limiting. Racism is very limiting. Social distancing, COVID-19, it's very limiting. So you've got multiple influences of limit against a society that is weakened, and then you have a group of people that are further weakened as a result. And so it's like, how do we recognize that, not pacify it or make excuses for it, and then collectively work to strengthen it? And what does that look like? And what I love about kind of the discussion that we had is saying, okay, obviously Black people need to be part of the solution for Black experience, but I believe only Black people can't be a part of that experience either, because we're not in the rooms where it happens for a lot of things, And I have friends who are from all nations who are in power, who are in positions of power and authority. I have friends who are cops. I have friends who are in jail. I have friends that run the whole spectrum. I have friends who are millionaires, and I have friends who are homeless. Legitimately, I have friends right now in the New York subway system by choice who are homeless. And then I have friends who have 3 or 4 homes and whose wealth is very dominant. And so I have this spectrum of people that I have access to. And when you look at that, you have to look at, first of all, how do you look at that group? The way that I look at my friends too, who are homeless, and the way that I look at the person who's millionaire, and who they are and in what they deserve, it's not different. They all deserve honor, respect, humanity, conversation, food, all of the basics of our life, they deserve. So I think when it comes to kind of the conversation of racism, it's that quite often there are policies put in place that heavily weigh one against the other. And what we're trying to fight for is just the most basic of rights of every person. And that basic right is to be able to live, to be able to create life, and to be able to navigate life without offense based on how you look, where you come from, how much money you make, and even who you associate yourself with. Because I went to this kind of interracial grade school. From that experience, I decided to go to an all-Black high school, because I was like, okay, but I'm done with this. I'm going to go and just be around a lot of Black people. And Black people are awesome, but you also realize that humanity is just humanity. So even in that experience, I started to see that, there's also layers of, status and class and other things amongst just Black people. So it's not a Black-white thing. It's a how do we deal with one another thing. And so if we are just dealing with one another and dealing with one another like we really do want to know, you may not want to care about everyone. You may want to care about everyone, but in truth, you aren't going to really want to care about everyone. But you should treat that person and care for that person despite that. And that's what I think. Because sometimes I can see someone, and, there's certain things I don't like about people. I don't like violent people. I don't like people who bully. Like, there are all these situations where I'm like, I don't like that person for this reason or that reason, whatever it is. I see injustice and I fumigate, which is why I didn't participate in the protest, because I've protested several times throughout my life. But I know me. In order for me to go to a protest, I have to be in a certain mindset. I was not in that mindset when the protests were happening. And so why would I show up unable to really effectively participate in a way that's honorable of his experience, right? It's like, you gotta know yourself. But within that, it's just caring enough about life to actually want to treat every person the way that, it's so cliche, the way that you would want to be treated, despite how you might feel about that person or where they're from or who they are or what they bring to the table or how they can serve you, what they can do for you. None of that matters. And if you make the choice from that, then you've done your duty, I think. Like that's like you've done your humane duty to just do it. And I liken it sometimes with when I encounter someone who I don't like there's not a lot of people I don't like. Okay, I'm very friendly. I'm from Chicago. I'm simply saying, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you like I love all people, because that's not true. But when I look at a person, I think, how would I treat a child? Like, how would you treat a child? Most people would not treat a child with such disgruntling and disdain. You would never see someone put their knee on the neck of it's unlikely that you would see someone put their knee on the neck of a child for 8 minutes, right? If we could all operate from cherishing the life of someone in that way, perhaps with that as an anchor, and really being able to consider the effect of that, because we don't do it because hopefully, like we know better and regret it that that's wrong. But also with a child, we consider the mental impact for that child, the physical impact of that child, kind of all of those things. But let's look at moving beyond just the physical of, oh gosh, I would never do that. Because there's lots of people who are like, I would never put my knee on the neck of a person. But would you, question if, that person who just walked into your store can actually afford your stuff because they're dressed with their pants hanging off their butt? Like it's little things like that where it's like, how do you view people who are not like you? Like what judgments do you place on people who are not like you just because they're not like you? And that's what we have to challenge in ourselves.
And I think as you're speaking through that, that's why the grace that Jesus brings into our lives is so crucial in this process. And really is, I would argue, the foundation for the answer. Because grace steps in and says, we're going to stop valuing people even based on their actions.
Right, exactly.
Right, and you're talking about, well, okay, I don't like violent people, but grace even steps in and says, no, I'm going to give you the ability to even love people like that. I'm going to give you love, whatever it is, because we all recognize that God shouldn't have liked us.
Right.
that we
daily,
yeah.
Like not shouldn't have, but should not.
Right.
Like today.
Exactly. And so it becomes this. It changes the whole dynamic, and says, okay, I'm not going to value you based on color of your skin. I'm not going to value you based on there's so many different factors to that, right? Yeah. I'm not going to value you based on your social class. I'm not going to value you based on
dress, how you talk, all these things.
I'm not going to value you based on your actions. Why? Because God has stepped into our lives and decided, no, I'm going to value you because you are my creation, and I'm going to give my son for you. Mm-hmm. And I don't care who you are. Jesus gave his life for you. And that communicates to me your value.
Right.
I always argue something is only as valuable as what someone's willing to pay for it.
Yep.
Right? That's basic economics, right? Mm-hmm. Something is only as valuable as what someone is willing to pay for it. And if someone is willing to pay an amount for something, it sets its value.
Right.
Even if there's only one person willing to pay it,
exactly.
It still sets its value. So when God steps in and says, I'm giving my son for you, it sets that value for every single person. And to be able to walk into each one of our each of our individual lives and say, okay, I'm going to value every person that way.
Yes, exactly.
And interact with them and honor them. And obviously, like you said, this challenges us every day, every situation, every circumstance. And and it's just a constant growth process for us. But it allows us to be able to see each other that way, interact with one another that way. And I think it opens the door for us to trust each other in the conversation, because we recognize that we can trust God. And we recognize that He's called us to engage people this way. And I think for a lot of those who are listening, trusting people in that way is really hard. To be vulnerable, like we've talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm often teased that I'm too trusting. Black girl from the projects, right? Like, I'm often told that I'm too trusting because my standard is the moment that I meet someone, I trust them. And that's not popular in the way that we live today. It's like, the moment I meet someone, I trust them because you haven't done anything for me not to trust you. Now, I'm not stupid if you do a couple of things over and over again that show that I can't leave my wallet all around you. I'm not going to leave my wallet out. But trust is automatic. And that's a hard concept to grasp if you grow up in a society where that's frowned upon, or if you grow up in a society where trust has been manipulated. Because there's this really kind of disparaging response where, yeah, but America was founded on Christianity, and look what that led us to. We still have this system of oppression and racism and protest. And to that, and of course, as a Black woman, I get that all the time from people who are not Christian. They're like, oh, but you're Christianity, you know, all this stuff. And when I studied the Bible, one of my questions with the group of people that I was studying with, because I studied the Bible, I said, I'll study it, because if I can prove that it's not true, then I don't have to follow it. So I studied the Bible looking for the loopholes, because I'm a very academic person, as I told you. I'm very well researched. So it's like, great, I'll study the Bible. I'll study the Bible so that if I then can discredit it, I don't have to live by it. Obviously, I didn't find that. But one of the questions that I went to my white friends with, and there was one Black girl, one of the questions that I went to the study group with, kind of in my blanket, I said, okay, well, what about slavery? What does God say about slavery? Like, tell me about slavery, because you want me to follow this Bible and you want me to follow Jesus, but tell me about slavery. Like, why did that happen? And they were so smart. They were so smart. Like, it was brilliant, because they looked at me and they said, no answer that we give you is going to suffice. So you're going to have to study that. So you're going to have to dig into this Bible, and you're going to have to study it for yourself, because ultimately that's the only thing that matters. God needs to have that conversation with you, not us. And I was like, in my head, how dare they? But then I went and I studied it. And God is awesome, because He answered me. And He answered me in a way that it's now been, how old am I? I'm 50. So it's been like more than 2 decades, 25 years. Yeah. Of me staying solid in that belief. I could tell you all the answers that I found, but why would I do that? Why would I rob you of your opportunity to study it for yourself and get that answer for your own conviction? But let me tell you, the answer is in there. And it was like the most beautiful thing, because today we're told, America was, founded on Christianity, and our forefathers, and, Blacks weren't written into that concept of fairness and justice and Christianity. And as legitimate as that may be, it does not change who God is, and it does not change our personal responsibility to live by that truth instead of what someone else presented as a truth, right? And I think that ultimately becomes the anchor. As you said, when we look at God and we look at forgiveness and we look at who we can be because of what he gave, then we have to know that our response to that, I believe, like when I became Christian, I truly believe that Jesus would have gone to the cross if I was the only one that he was willing to save. If I was the only one that was going to respond and it was going to be thousands of years later, he still would have done it. When I think about it, it almost makes me want to, like, he still would have done it. If the rest of you were like, not going to make it happen, he still would have done it. That I'm that valuable to him, that I matter, that this Black life, that I matter that much, where he would have endured those 33 years just for me. And so how can I not then in my life, as I go through the beauties and the challenges and the beautiful days and the days where I'm in a brain hemorrhage, like how do I not like champion that in a way where I feel completely covered? And covered doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, and covered doesn't mean that it's going to work out for my best interest, but it means that ultimately, like, it works out for me being side by side with God. And like, I know that like when I'm with God, I won't even be 6 feet away, you know? So it allows me to have difficult conversations with my friends. It allows me to stand up in institutions where they don't understand the Black experience. And I'm willing to stand up and explain to them like what that Black experience is like. And it allows me to open myself up to the people who are like me and to the people who are not like me, and to be willing to take the backlash and be willing to redirect because of this greater understanding and enlightening that I feel that I have, and this obligation to live this like life that I believe has been presented with so much purpose and so much joy and so much promise, you know, just for my little lifetime, you know, knowing that I'm just one person, but just for my little lifetime. So, because we don't know, like, after I die, this world might not be here, because it might have been just me. He might be like, she's gone, we're done. You don't know. I'm not saying that's the case. I think he did it for a lot of people, but I'm just saying, like, I don't fear, I was gonna say, I don't fear death. And it's interesting because this word fear has come up a lot initially with COVID-19, and then kind of with the protests, and especially kind of with media, I feel like perpetuates fear in so many ways. And I was talking to you before about like one of the exercises that I do when it comes to fear is I kind of take myself through this mental process of finding evidence to the contrary. So when I see a threatening situation, this is a scenario, this hasn't happened recently, but there's a group of white people with bottles coming at me, right? Like, okay, if I feel fear, okay, what's the reality here? The reality is they're all drinking beer and they're all going to a bar, and you have not been, attacked by, white people since you were a child, and, just kind of all these things. And so I take myself through this process of evidence against the contrary. And it's like how you were saying with your friend, how you went to this Black school and they were like, oh, you kind of can't sit here. And you still had a close relationship with that person. Like that Black guy, when he is faced with someone who may seem threatening, or he's not sure of their intentions, he's not sure why they want to get to know him, or why they're wanting to sit and have lunch with him, he can go, okay, what evidence do I have to the contrary? Well, I know that, Chris and I had a great conversation. So I know that, white guys can be trusted. And I know that not everyone has ill intent. And I know that, this thing and that thing and that thing. And you stack up this evidence to the contrary that then alleviates the fear, because fear is often a response to the imagined and unknown and not directly to the truth. And so if it's imagined and it's unknown, the fear is not always legitimate. And I think as a people and as followers of Christ, if we can create more of those pieces of evidence for one another, then we start to dissect and diffuse the fear that so many people have, because we're changing the experience. And in the end, the experience is the thing that's the problem, right? And so we change it.
And I think the fear, in addition to what you said, is also the result of wounds.
Yeah.
Especially if they're unhealed.
Right.
If they remain open. And as you're talking through that, I think it's so powerful that it's not impersonal facts that are going to change that. That and sometimes we get into these conversations, people rattle off facts about this or facts about that.
Yeah.
That's not going to change it. It has to be personal experience, that those personal moments where you're connecting with someone and realizing, wait a second, the world isn't the way that I thought.
Right.
The people aren't the way that I thought. And that really leads to one of the things that you and I have been talked about, and that is just what that looks like for our church family. And for those of you who are watching, we've talked about this and are really going to continue that conversation of how do we create a space for healing, that triage that you're talking about, that I think is so crucial, that it's not that triage isn't just people like you.
Right. Because
there's a greater understanding that's necessary. And one of the things, and I think it's true that, okay, you can never fully understand someone else.
Right.
Right. And like you said, you can't fully understand them. But that should not stop us from seeking understanding.
Right.
If that's the mindset that we take, then we are lost as human beings. Because one of our greatest gifts is empathy. And I can't fully understand it, but you can through experience and conversation, right? Especially when we're vulnerable and we can come to a place where we're able to engage life empathetically with one another. And as we step into moments, I'm so familiar with what it is that you've shared about, not just sharing about you, but really shared with me, that I can, and this is crucial in all relationships, I can, in the midst of this moment, not only see how this affects me, but understand how this would affect you.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And how this is gonna make you feel, and understand that it's very different for each of us. But that helps. That's crucial in being able to love one another well. So
like the facts piece is a big one, because there are too many moments that happen in our life for us to factualize, right? And even in our conversations, we don't talk. Even when we were, when we first met, a decade or so ago, and we were talking about social media, which has become a whole different thing now. Like, it wasn't about facts. It was like, what do people need to know so that they can understand the kind of church we have, the values that we have, what we have as purpose, what we mean to one another. And even our conversation together, when I reached out, a week and a half or so ago, I didn't talk to you and say, here are the facts, here's the percentage of, African Americans in America, and here's the percentage of, impeding racism that happens, and here are the situations, and here's the crime rate and all that. No, I said, hey, I want to share my story with you. Here's what happened to me. Here's how that made me feel. Here's where I think we can start to create some access and opportunity for, both adults and the youth. And it's like, ultimately, whether you can step into someone's shoes or not, you have this opportunity to support, right? And it's that empathy piece of I don't know what it's like. It's funny to be a white man in America, you know. Nor do I want to or need to know that I need white men in America in my life, because I need people from all facets of life in my life. I believe that no one can be void. I just really believe that, right? No one can be void. How can I be a fully flushed human being with those gaps? I don't think I can.
And you're missing out when you live life that way. You're missing out on the beauty of the world and the beauty of what each individual brings into, and cultures too. What different cultures bring.
Absolutely.
And I've been working for about 1.5 years on a conversation called Unequal. And the reality that as God steps into our life, He doesn't say you're all equal.
Right.
He says, I've actually created you all individually where no two of you are the same. And I want for you to interact with one another, valuing that and stepping into each individual's life and realizing this individual brings something to the world that no one else does.
Right.
And I get to explore that and I get to find out what that is. And it's something, and being able to engage one another that way.
And I'll say, not just because, as Chris and I are talking, not just to the point of conversation. It's not, let's create a conversation group. That's not what we're talking about here. Like, we're talking about having conversation as well as action and planning and processing and everything else.
Exactly. Well, thank you for joining us. We lost our signal on the
That's just the text way of saying, wrap it up, girl, wrap it up. You talk so much. I'm very verbose.
The computer said, I'm tired. But we do thank you for joining us. We are live, so you may have heard kids playing outside, or I think they were mowing the lawn for a second as well, banging on some things, right. But that's part of the experience. But I know that you are grateful for Beatrice taking the time. I know I'm grateful.
And I'm open, so anyone that wants to talk to me, whether it's that you want to leave a comment or reach out to me or anything, I'm open. And, I'm candidly, transparently open. I'm like a window. Nothing really scares me, from Chicago, that's all I'm saying. But yeah, we're here to be more than what exists right now. And together we can help to create something new.
Yeah. And as we walk through this, we'll continue to keep you updated about, okay, what does that look like for us?
Yeah.
As we continue to explore this as a church family.
Yeah.
To make sure and to move through this in a way that it's not just a moment, and it doesn't just show up when it shows up on Twitter.
Exactly. Yes, it is not a social broadcast.
Yeah. So,
it's life.
Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.